Why should Netanyahu stop? In a way, that's a minor point, because it's all irrelevant anyway. It just diverts attention from the real issues, just the way the talk about illegal outposts diverts it. All the settlements are illegal. The settlements are not only illegal, but they have been designed carefully with U.S. aid to break up the West Bank into unviable cantons in which the population will be suffocated. Take a look at the map, it's obvious, not a secret. That's the issue. As for the illegality, that's accepted by everyone, including Israel. Back in 1967, after the June War, when Israel began under the Labor government its settlement program, its leading legal authority, Theodore Meron, highly respected international legal authority, he advised the government that any settlements are illegal in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention, the core of the foundation of international humanitarian law. The Israeli justice minister concurred. The most interesting reaction was from Moshe Dayan, who was defense minister and in charge of the occupied territories. He said, here's his words. He said, settling Israelis in occupied territories contravenes, as is known, international conventions, but there's nothing essentially new in that, so the issue can be dismissed. The World Court, just a couple of years ago, unanimously endorsed Meron's conclusion, and the Israeli High Court technically agreed, but while disagreeing in practice, its usual style. Actually, Dayan at the time, back in '67, he expressed the whole thing sort of poetically. He said, the situation today resembles the complex relationship between a Bedouin man and the girl he kidnaps against his will. You Palestinians, as a nation, don't want us today, but we'll change your attitude by forcing our presence on you. You will live like dogs, and whoever will leave, while we take what we want, land, water, and so on, and meanwhile the U.S. will pay for it and protects us. Okay, that's 1967, and so it continues with scarcely a break right now, and as Obama has made clear, there's not going to be any change there either. Meanwhile, the West Bank is being separated from Gaza by the U.S. and Israel. It's a long-standing U.S.-Israeli goal. That means that Israel will be free to strangle Gaza in more and more savage ways, tightening the siege, also driving the population away from the borders, land borders, which means they lose arable land, and sea borders. Since the year 2000, the Israeli Navy has been regularly carrying out naval operations without warning, driving Gaza fishing boats towards land. They can't operate more than a couple of kilometers off land, which means they can't fish because the water's so totally polluted after Israel's destruction of waste facilities and power plants that you can't fish nearby. Why are they doing that? Well, nobody's investigating it, but you can have some suspicions. In that year, 1999, in fact, the British gas company, major company, was exploring in the Eastern Mediterranean and found apparently quite substantial natural gas reserves off that whole coast, much of it in Gaza territorial waters. Right then, Israel started driving the fishermen back so that the territorial waters, in effect, are reduced, and it is negotiating with British gas to steal gas and resources. I mean, that's a major crime happening right before our eyes. You can read it in industry journals, but try to find some discussion of it or even investigation of it. Well, the current debate, there is currently a debate going on among those concerned with these issues. They say either, it runs roughly like this, either Israel and the United States will accept the international consensus, two-state settlement, or else Israel will be half Arab and pretty soon have a majority of Arabs, and then there could be an apartheid struggle, and like South Africa, then becomes, we'll go through the South African experience. That's not going to happen. Those are not the alternatives. There's a third alternative, namely that the United States and Israel will do exactly what they're doing. That's what Ehud Olmert, former prime minister, called convergence. Take over the land, annex the land behind the so-called separation wall. It's actually an annexation wall, much of the arable land and also the major water resources. So just take that, take the Jordan Valley, it's about a third of the territory, essentially imprisons the rest, break up what's left with sad-ins, cutting right through. If you look at the settlement programs, that's what they are, vastly expanded Jerusalem, going straight to an major Israeli settlement, Malda Adumim, all the way to Jericho, pretty much bisects the West Bank. That was on Clinton years mainly, a couple more in the north, and the rest will be enclosed by a whole network of complex infrastructure, superhighways for Israelis and visitors only, all the infrastructure connecting them, checkpoints all over the place, and somehow the population the program will follow Dayan's principle. You'll live like dogs, and whoever leaves will leave. And it doesn't mean that the Palestinians will be eliminated. I mean, they can be kept in remote areas. And in fact, I wouldn't be surprised if the Israeli Tourism Bureau is in favor of that. It would be really nice for American visitors to drive through on the superhighways and see off in the hills, a man pulling a goat, biblical scene, sort of keeps the picture. Most of the biblical landscape needs to be wiped out by construction, but that'll look nice. Maybe he's going off to get some water from one of the wells that hasn't run dry as Israel's taking the groundwater, and incidentally pouring wastewater into the West Bank from Jerusalem and from the settlements. There's a recent Salem report about that. Meanwhile, the U.S. government is quite happy with all of this. As far as the U.S. government is concerned, it has a powerful, rich country right on the periphery of the most important region in the world with the stupendous energy resources. It's a powerful military force. It's basically an offshore military base for the U.S. There's very close military intelligence contacts. The U.S. is using Israel to pre-position weapons. In fact, you may have noticed, though it wasn't reported here, that during the Gaza war in January, the United States was trying to send arms to Israel, It was trying to send arms, heavy arms. It was having some problems because in Greece, the dock workers and others refused to load them, so it had to do it in a complicated way. When the Pentagon was asked about this, they explained correctly that the arms were not intended for Israeli use in the war against Gaza. They were being pre-positioned in Israel for potential U.S. use for their military operations. Well, all of that is valuable. Quite apart from military connections, high-tech industry relations are quite close. U.S. investment in Israeli high-tech industries is increasing. Intel has recently announced that it's building its major factory in the world to produce the next generation of chips in Israel because the situation there is very, very convenient for U.S. investment, high-tech investment. In contrast, the Palestinians have nothing to offer at all. They're weak, they're friendless, and so they don't have any rights by the most elementary principles of political order, as long as we accept it, of course. So there's not going to be any apartheid struggle. The choices are pretty stark. Either it'll be a two-state settlement in accord with the position of the world, or else it'll be what Israeli sociologist Baruch Kimmerling, lead sociologist, called politicide, just the murder of a nation, which is what we're observing and in fact contributing to. Well, there's another claim, which is that Israel can't evacuate the settlers because it'll lead to civil war. But there's no need to evacuate.